Yes, now I was waiting for the microphone to start. Okay, let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining. After lunch, I know it's a difficult time, second day after lunch, so I'm very glad you came. I'm particularly glad that you came because this is a session that you maybe don't necessarily expect at a security conference. We'll be talking about the environment, we'll be talking about natural resources, and how they link to questions of security, to questions of strategy, and how we can bring the security community, the environment, the natural resources community together. We're still missing one speaker, as you can see, but I think we'll start anyway. He might hopefully join in a bit. Otherwise, we'll just have more time for audience questions. So get your questions ready anytime, write them down, and there'll be ample of room to ask that. Let me introduce myself first quickly. My name is Susanne Schmeier. I work for IHE Delft, which is the UNESCO-founded Institute for Water Education in the Netherlands, and also for the Global Environment Facility's strategic scientific and technical advisory panel, so sort of migrating between science and policy and between security and the environment, as are most of my distinguished panel members here, and that's also what we'll be focusing on today. I said already there is a link between the environment, natural resources on the one hand, and security on the other that is often, I find personally, a bit underexplored at security conferences. So some of us were just last week in Stockholm where we had the World Water Week, which is a place where water people typically talk to water people and how bad this is all about water and how much that affects security, where we're typically not so good at talking to a security audience. So I think it's great that we managed, also thanks to Ambassador Tanja Miškova and others, that we managed to bring the topic to this Bled Strategic Forum. And we really want to look with our panel members today at how the environment, how natural resources can affect conflict, can maybe be a threat multiplier in conflict, but can also be affected by conflict, so being a victim of armed conflict, of instability, of fragility. And what we hope to get out of this session is really a dialogue between the environment and the security community on how we can work together, how we can build this environment security nexus, with this session specifically looking at natural resources in the context of conflict, typically, but not only armed conflict. And to do so, I'm very happy that I have 3, and soon I hope 4, people with me here on the stage, and one more person online that I'll introduce in a second. Let me start with the people here on the stage. To my left, directly next to me is Mark Zeitoun. He's the Director General of the Geneva Water Hub, based in Geneva, Switzerland. And he focuses a lot on water mainly, but also the environment more generally, in the context of conflict and cooperation, specifically also water being affected by armed conflict. We have next Ambika Vishwanath. She's the co-founder and the director of the Kubernein initiative in India. That's an independent, as I also only recently learned, female-led geopolitical advisory firm that works on linking questions of environment, security, and many others. And then we have Munini Mutuku. She is a senior program officer at the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, and we'll hear from her later, I think, what that is exactly, because that's a very interesting mechanism that exists in Kenya that is tasked to promote equal opportunities, good relations, harmony, and peaceful coexistence, which I think is quite a challenge everywhere in the world. So we're very curious to hear from you. And then we have online Benedetta Berti. She's the head of policy planning in the Office of the Secretary General at NATO. She's joining us from Brussels. And at NATO, and also in previous roles, she's been working on human security, conflict, both internal and international, but also the role of the environment in conflict, but also post-conflict situations. And I want to start us off with a question to all of you, where you can also respond, reflect together. And I'll start with you, Munini. What do you think? How can interactions between different communities, different diplomacies, notably the security community and the environment or natural resources community, be stimulated? How can we make them work together better when it comes to addressing environmental challenges that might affect conflict and security, but also the other way around, conflict affecting the environment.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I want to thank the organizers of this panel. First, we need to understand the space that we are in. Conflicts are changing. And one of the changes is we are seeing the use of technology, new technology in conflict spaces. Drones in conflict, but we're also seeing social media in conflict spaces. And you're talking about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation within these spaces. So with the reality of the new dynamics within the conflict space, then the question goes to the development, the security, the humanitarian actor. How are you adapting to these new changes? So that as we come together to interact together, then we come as a reformed people or an updated people on the realities that we're dealing with. But we also have another new frontier, which is the frontier we're talking about, environment. We're not talking about green conflicts, conflicts that are being created because of the green transition. We're talking about communities against communities, communities and multinational companies having conflicts. We're talking about governments and communities having conflicts because of the access, use, and ownership of the resources that are needed, which some are critical, as they call them, to the new transition. So with this reality, we need to recognize that there are a lot of complexities and interdependencies within the sector of peace building, humanitarian action, and environment. So the question, like you ask, is then how do we stimulate this? How about strategies that are interconnected? We need to stop working in silos. We need to start speaking to each other. But as I said, as an updated each other, with the reality of the new conflicts or emerging conflicts on the table and having reviewed our strategies in reference to the same. We also need to listen to the beneficiaries of our work. Communities have knowledge. Communities live in ecosystems. Communities live in environments, and they have knowledge and understanding of how these systems are changing, how these systems are either contributing to conflict, are being dragged into conflict, or are becoming victims of the conflicts that are going on. So listening to the communities or hearing the communities gives us a similar platform of addressing the issues that the communities are raising on these matters. Again, it can be stimulated through acknowledging the tensions between the humanitarian, the development, and the security. Because the development wants to do things in a certain way, the environment says a certain way, and the security says a certain way. For instance, we've seen the development asking the assistance of the security to deal with their community because they want to do their development, and the community says, no, this is our ecosystem, this is our environment. So those tensions, how do we stimulate our interaction within those tensions? Until we recognize and we acknowledge that we have tensions within, then we cannot go out to work as a common front. So that needs to be addressed. But again, we are talking about the global north and the global south. We need a change of attitude and a change of mentality on how we look at the global south. A place of extraction, a place where lands are empty and they are available for use by the development. Is it really the reality? Again, we have a power relation between the global north and the global south. We want to tell you what to do. The global south, you need to listen. We will know about your environment. We know about what needs to be done in your area more than you do. We need to disrupt that power dynamic. And it's not only the global south that has to do it. It's not only the global north that has to do it. It's both that have to do it within this sector so that we are able to work together as we move forward. Another issue is that we need true partnerships, partnerships that are really interested in addressing the issues that are going on in the global south within this sector. When we talk about multinational companies from the global north that are wreaking havoc in our communities in the global south, where are our true partners in the global north who can help us hold these institutions accountable, especially in reference to our environments and our ecosystems? We need to create that accountability between the global north and the global south within the humanitarian, development, and security sector. And that is one way that we can stimulate this interaction. But also to add, we need to recognize that we have differences, because the North and the South, we have differences in how we look at certain things. For us, the river is a source of identity. For the global North, it's probably a river. It doesn't have an identity. It doesn't give you an identity, just for example. Religion is important for us, and the environment and religion is interconnected. But it doesn't come the same way from the actor in the global North. So when we recognize those differences and we acknowledge these differences, then we are able to interact and to have partners who are really willing to work with us at our own level, or in a way that is mutually beneficial for the work that the global North is helping us in the global South to do and to accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I hand over to you, Ambika, I just want to take a moment to introduce our last panelist who just joined us, who's in high demand. Ahmed Abdel-Latif, he's the Director General of the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peacebuilding, obviously Cairo, Egypt. And the center and he himself work on preventing, mitigating, and resolving conflicts through facilitation, dialogue, including in the context of the environment. And just to update you, we just started with a first introductory question where I wanted to know from all panelists how you think, and I like that you used the word partnership so much, Munini, how interactions between different sectors, or partnerships, maybe we should call it, can be forged when it comes to addressing environment, security, nexus question. And I want to hand over to you, Ambika. What would you like to add?
Thank you, Susanne. And I also want to thank the organizers. This is my first time in Bled. This is my first time in Slovenia, and it's absolutely beautiful. So I will echo what another panelist said in one of the earlier sessions, and that I hope I will be invited again. Maybe we'll see after the end of this session, right? I'll build a little bit on what Munini said, but also react to what you said right up front, is that normally in these security discussions, we don't have these kind of panels. I have been at these kind of security discussions, not this particular one, but the MSC, to the Shangri-La, the Raisina in India, to Australia and other countries, where security is still thought of in the same manner that they've been thought of for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Now, after the world wars, with the advent of the Cold War, and then sort of the change in how we've seen countries develop, the kind of security threats that we saw have also changed. They went from nuclear to biological to technical to artificial intelligence to space. But nowhere in all of that did we consider the environment. The environment is still considered as something that the development sector people work on, that women and community groups work on. The environment is also seen as something we need for our growth as human beings, whatever that growth might look like depending on where we come from. And while that is true to a certain extent, water, land, the oceans, heat, all of that is required for what it is. If we don't think of it as part of that security apparatus, we will not be able to do the kind of development we would like to see for our growth, and that might look differently in different countries. So Munini talked a lot about partnerships, and I wrote that down. She also talked about change of attitude, right? What does a nature security nexus, conflict nexus look like? Very simply, it is in conflict zones, you see the environment is being affected. When the environment is being affected, that leads to conflict. So it's a very simple cycle in some ways, but it's also a very complicated cycle because how that cycle plays out looks very different in different regions. It also looks different when you look at it from the perspective of whether that resource is water, whether it is land, whether it is a form of new emerging energy, whether it is the sea, or any other kind of resource that is the community is dependent on. So when we think about change of attitude, it's very important now that we place all of this within that security apparatus. And I say very deliberately security apparatus and not security, because in places like this, security equals to military, military equals to defense. equals to 3% of your GDP that you're spending on weapons. And then everyone's like, oh my God, we cannot reduce that spending, right? In the last year alone, we've seen globally there's been a 35% increase in defense spending around the world. This is not just in Europe because of what's happening in Ukraine, but around the world, 35-year high. So I say security apparatus because, of course, it's that entire line, but it's also everything else that's part of your security. So when you think about it from a cyber perspective, when you think about it from personnel, even things like what we have in South Asia, the NDRF, all countries have an NDRF, National Defense, Disaster Relief Forces. They are made up of people who are from the security, from the defense spaces, but they are also people who are peacekeepers, they are also police forces, they are also community people, right? So, and they come together and form the NDRF, and all South Asian countries have them. Many other countries in Asia also have them, and I know you have versions of them here in Europe and in other countries. So how do we think about how all of this needs to react, be a little bit more proactive when it comes to how we think about what is a nature or an environment-related conflict? And that's where then that change of attitude comes into play. For too long, our security apparatus has only been reactive. So when there is an environment-related or environment-linked risk or a disaster that happens, disasters are usually environment hazards that are exacerbated by human interference, and then they become a disaster. Then you have militaries are called in, NDRF forces are called in. They go in, they do the best work that they can. We've seen this everything from, a little bit more recently, earthquakes in the Himalayan regions, floods here in Europe. Go back a little, tsunami of 2004, which was a huge game changer in South Asia and in parts of Asia. To back before that, right? It also depends on when you see things like hackers coming and hacking into systems that control water resources, to systems that control your dams, to systems that control all of your energy output. And the more we rely on technology, the more we're going to see of that. But it's very reactive in many ways. How do we make this more proactive? And a change of attitude then is how we make that more proactive. How can we use that security apparatus very positively to ensure that conflicts that we can see coming can be to a certain degree mitigated. I do not want to say prevented because that's too idealistic in a way, but can we think about them so that we can try to be more proactive in mitigating that? And the other thing I want to say before we move on here is about what does that actually look like, right? Conflicts are no longer how we imagine them to be. Even in my 45 years, they have completely changed the nature of what they are. We need to rethink then how our security also is. That we have not done that. We have understood to a certain degree that climate change, that the environment, that food, your water, your health, all forms of environment-related, energy-linked security is under stress. But these two bodies, they're not talking. So we have changed a little bit our thinking on what environment and everything else connected to it means. But how do we rethink our security? That is not yet started. So we need to start a little bit over there as well.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I have some examples, but I can come back to them.
Okay. Yeah, I indeed hope we can drill in more detail into some of the things you said. I think what Ambika highlighted really shows the complexity on both sides, on the environment and on the security side, right? Environment, what's the environment? It's water, land, it's biodiversity, but it's also oil, it's minerals, it's diamonds, whatever it might be. So many, many different things that we probably shouldn't be throwing in the same pot. And the same on the security side. You highlighted the traditional security, military, the security apparatus, but also we're seeing non-traditional conflicts from cyber, hacker, you mentioned, to the environmental dimension. So we're not in a three-dimensional space even anymore, but in a multi-dimensional space. So I hope we can drill into some of these, probably not all of them in this session. But having talked about the security apparatus, of course makes me turn to Benedetta, because Benedetta, looking at you, you probably can't see me, but NATO would probably classify as the classic security sector, yet NATO has in the past years really made an effort to look into environmental security questions. So what have you learned in terms of bringing different communities, different sectors together from the security sector engaging with the environment?
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. Greetings from Tbilisi in Georgia, where I am at the moment. So you ask a very good question, and I think I also really like the framing, which is recognizing that NATO as an alliance has been doing a lot to adapt what essentially we see as the most complex and volatile and unpredictable and dangerous security environment in generations. And that has required a really multifaceted adaptation for our alliance. So absolutely, on the one hand, especially since 2014, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, we have been rebuilding and strengthening our conventional deterrence and our deterrence and defense posture to ensure that we can credibly, effectively, and sustainably ensure the defense of Europe, which is our core mandate. But we're also very much aware that traditional strong militaries are necessary, but they're not sufficient to deal with a world of multi-threats, poly-crisis. And so we are also more and more, and you can see that in the strategy NATO approved in 2022, our strategic concept, where we say, we need to prepare for the threat posed by the Russian Federation, for the systemic challenge that we see from China, but we also need to understand and adapt to the impact of non-traditional security challenges like fragile government institutions, health emergencies, food insecurity, and crucially climate change, which has been a driver of our adaptation over the last few years. And very quickly, and just to echo what our previous panelists have said, that requires, first of all, a deep understanding of how non-traditional security challenges are affecting conflicts and instability. And climate change gives us a very important lens to look at this, but I would broaden it. It is not just climate change, it is climate change, environmental degradation at large, air pollution, biodiversity loss. All of these issues combined have an impact on conflicts. They exacerbate them, they prolong them, they produce scarcity, which in turn can affect and make a conflict dynamic more acute. It can generate mass displacement of people, which has in itself humanitarian and security consequences. So at the very minimum, we are understanding that you cannot do conflict prevention and analysis and management successfully if you do not integrate into your planning, into your thinking, these considerations: climate, environment, health, and food security. They become really important to understanding conflict dynamics. So I think we're doing quite a lot in that sense, in the analytical sense. And to do that, to answer your question, we cannot do it alone. We're not the experts. We need to work with the development community, with the diplomatic community, with the climate community. We come from different places and our interests are not always the same, but I think we have enough shared common goals: stability, peace, contributed to conflict management or resolution in a way that makes us all more secure. So we're having those dialogues structured around how does environmental degradation, climate change affect conflict. I would also say the opposite is also true. We see that conflicts worsen environmental security and worsen and make climate adaptation at times more difficult. And we see this, for example, in the case of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, where we see deliberate attacks against energy infrastructure, against food supply chains. We see deliberate attempts to increase environmental degradation. The Ukrainian government, in its peace proposal, also talk about how do we address the climate of ecocide that the Russian Federation is deliberately carrying out in Ukraine. So there is a binary relation. Environmental degradation affects conflict, but conflict also makes tackling environmental crisis all the more difficult. And so this dialogue needs to be really quite holistic. And of course, in a world of growing strategic competition, we also know that conflict over natural resources is intensified. And of course, that's something that we also look at very attentively. And you mentioned this at the beginning. There is a relationship between energy efficiency, energy self-sufficiency, climate change adaptation, and strategic competition. And at the the nexus of this important imperatives, you see increased tensions and quest over rare earth minerals. And of course, that also has an impact on conflict and intensifies strategic competition. I could go on and on with examples, but what I'm trying to say is that you cannot have a sustainable, credible, strong defense in the conventional sense if you do not integrate this non-traditional human security, energy security, health security, and environmental security considerations. So I think at the analytical level, we're there. Practically speaking, and I don't want to monopolize or take too much time, so I'm happy to go more into the examples in the Q&A or later if you want me to elaborate. For us as NATO, that has meant really broadening how we think about security, who we think is a security partner or security interlocutor, reaching out to the climate community, having a much more robust dialogue with the private sector over, for example, the intersection between climate adaptation and emerging technologies and defense. But really also in the context of complex emergency, thinking about sustained dialogue with civil society, because as was said by the other panelists, you can really not understand conflict dynamics without engaging at the local level with the local community to understand them as the first, not just those that first experience the impact of conflict, but I think also those that are best placed in many cases to be the first responders. So you want to work with, by, and through them. And so those dialogues have become, I think, more part and parcel of how we work. And I'll stop here.
Thanks, Benedetta. You said a few times that it has to be practical, and I think one of the communities or the areas, let's say, where the environmental community and the security community have been working together quite a bit in the past is water. So I want to turn to you, Mark, because you've worked a lot on water from a more water, but also a more security perspective. What have you learned in terms of bringing together the security and the environment community? Is it possible? Has it been effective?
It's possible. Sorry, yeah, it's possible, and it's absolutely necessary. I mean, conflicts these days are extremely complex. I think we understand that now. The environment is just part of it, as Benedetta was just saying. Identity, history, retribution, all these things are wrapped up into it. And to address that in a single dimension way, like just through military hardware or doctrine, is clearly not good enough. I mean, the doctrine has to adapt, like the other people have made the case. The fact that the environment is wrapped up deeply within this, I mean, it's not, the environment isn't an issue. We are part of the environment is part of us. And so sorting that out means absolutely understanding the way that the conflicts affect the environment and vice versa, but not so linearly, all in one game. Consider also that most conflicts these days are protracted. They go on and on and on. Think of Gaza. Since 1948, it's been spikes of extreme violence. And so the new normal is protracted conflicts where the environment suffers for a very long time. Question is, how do we do something about it? Or how do we bring the multiple types of diplomacy and security required to deal with it? I think, first of all, I'm encouraged a little bit by these triple nexus discussions. So there's the World Bank and the ICRC and development actors talking about bridging that false divide between the humanitarian and development assistance. I won't dwell too much more on that, but I think we also have to broaden the diplomatic community fully. I mean, diplomats, formal diplomats, we have one with us here, Ambassador Mishkova. I think she will also tell you that water has a great appeal for dealing with all these issues. Water, first of all, if you think about the Sava River, which goes from here, Slovenia, down through Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina to Belgrade, it's a common issue, whether you like it or not. Rivers tie states together. The fate of the river, the fate of everyone dependent on the river, the fate of the ecosystems ties all the states together. And if you try to slice up that river and manage it separately, then you will have predictable consequences. Because it's a common issue, these states have to talk together. And when they talk together, then when the technical teams talk together, the managers, then those talks can actually be politicized or diplomatized. I mean, thankfully on the Sava River, we're not at, the tensions are reduced right now, but think about the Tigris and Euphrates, which flow from Turkey through and Iran and Syria through Iraq. These countries have to manage their water together. Technical people do manage to talk. Can these talks be diplomatized? Water is also a great connector, so it's good for diplomacy because you can do issue linkage, for negotiations. Water produces energy, water produces food, and so you can use the links or the benefits that come from water to broaden the negotiations pie. And water is seen as apolitical. So again, the technical side, people talk about issues. Often the politicians in the capitals, the ministries of foreign affairs, let the technicians talk. It's not as heated an issue as many other issues. So again, then those talks can be diplomatized. But I think military actors have to be brought into the diplomacy as well, because evidently, if you look at Ukraine, like Benedetta was mentioning, or Gaza, or Sudan, or Ethiopia, or Yemen, the water needs to be protected from war. Now, this is the hard security side. Water really needs to be protected from war. We're seeing the greater abuse of water in war, the actual use of water as a weapon in war, or at least as a victim of war. So, and the consequences are enormous. I mean, the suffering, very predictable suffering. We've done studies, for instance, in Gaza. It's no surprise that dysentery happens, and dysentery kills children who have no immune to it. It's an actual killer. And or polio, and or in other conflicts, cholera. And I don't know if you've seen the evidence of a cholera epidemic, but I'm a humanitarian aid water engineer, and I've seen it. It's not pretty. It's not something you would wish on your enemies even. You're basically defecating yourself to death. And to prevent that, we've got to speak out against the use of water as a weapon at every turn. But what I'm seeing is, in fact, and this was alluded to yesterday during the panel, some sort of paralysis in Europe. I think sometimes it's called out in the Ukraine, but not always and not consistently, the use of water as a weapon. It's not called out very much at all in Gaza, I would say. I don't hear it. I don't feel a great reaction against the use of water as a weapon. And yet when we speak to militaries, they say that there's actually not such a great military objective in doing such. And so if the doctrine could be changed to realize what the military knows, then maybe water and the people and all the suffering can be prevented. And that's why the military have to be brought to the table as well. I can elaborate perhaps on the next round.
Yep. Thanks, Mark. I think that's very interesting because you show really the two sides of water in a way. Water being affected by war and leading to horrible suffering, as you highlighted with Ukraine, with Gaza. But water also, in the case of the Sava, being really a peace builder, an entry point to peace. And it seems to me that only if we do get the different communities together, not only environment and security, but also humanitarian, development, diplomacy, the 4 Ds, as we like to call them, only then can we move away from that sort of, I guess, negative vicious cycle to a more positive virtuous cycle where water leads to peace. But we haven't been overly successful with that, I think, around the world. And one region that's unfortunately often mentioned is the Middle East. I want to turn to you, Ahmed. What's your experience? Can be water, can be more generally with regards to environmental challenges. Do security and environment or water actors in the region work together effectively, or what could they improve?
Okay, thank you, and apologies for joining late. And also a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's my first time as Ambika in the Bled Strategic Forum and hope to be back. Also very impressed by the quality of the discussions, and also want to acknowledge the role of Slovenia in these issues of international corporations around climate change and water. And great to see this topic on the program of the forum. Maybe I'll just start because I was in my first panel this morning with President Turk on the Summit of the Future Multilateralism. And then I heard Peter Gerd, the Secretary General of the Forum, quoting a speaker and saying, well, actually, there's no crisis of multilateralism. It's a crisis of enforcement of multilateralism. And then taking as an example, United Nations Security Council resolutions, for instance, on Gaza, is the lack of implementation, lack of enforcement. But I think actually I would differ on this issue, actually. On this issue, it is not a problem of enforcement, it's a problem of the multilateralism, the design of the current system of international cooperation. There is really a blind spot around this issue. There is a blind spot around this issue, around the ability of the way multilateral system is set up to provide integrated responses to this triple nexus, in a holistic manner, because the system is set up to work in silos, not to work holistically. And that is something I want to emphasize at the beginning, and then link that to how my organization came into this discussion as a peace and security organization coming from this community rather than from the climate community. I think it has been already mentioned the linkages between conflict and natural resources. I'm not going to repeat that again. We originally focused on peace operations, and we know that most peace operations are in conflict-affected countries. Most conflict-affected countries, particularly in Africa, where we work a lot, are also climate-vulnerable countries. So conflict-affected countries, there's a correlation there. And conflict, so countries like Somalia, countries in the Sahel, are at the same time dealing simultaneously with the challenges of conflict, environmental degradation, climate change at a huge scale. When we look at drought and famine, for example, in Somalia, unprecedented over the past decades. And again, the international community is not well equipped to come holistically to address that. So it happened that Egypt was hosting COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022. So discussing with the COP presidency, they asked us, how can your center contribute to that? So we discussed, and we've been following a little bit the debate on what we call climate security that has been trying to tackle this issue. And we came up with an initiative that was launched at COP27 called Climate Responses for Sustaining Peace, CRISP. And it was the first time at COP that you had a high-level initiative on this topic, and that then was built upon in COP28 with a declaration on peace and climate. And the rationale behind this initiative was actually to talk less about security and to talk more about peace. Peace is a positive agenda. Peace is an agenda that can bring us all together, while security is immediately a more divisive issue, right, and touches on national security considerations and a whole range of issues. So we tried to frame this initiative in terms of, particularly we thought there was a big missing link between a huge issue of priority to countries in our region, Arab world or Africa, which is adaptation, climate adaptation, and peace building, right? These are two really policy objectives that had a lot of synergies, potential synergies between them, but the communities around them work in total isolation, don't know each other, have very different policy tools. Here you have the national adaptation plans on adaptation. Here you have, a conflict resolution mechanism, etc. That not enough dialogue and working holistically together. So we've worked through this initiative to try to bring these two worlds more together, bringing the peace and security actors we work with in our community in Africa and other parts of the world, and bring this issue to them in a way that builds these synergies in a very concrete manner. We developed, for example, the first, I think, training program made in Africa on climate programming for sustaining peace. It's a program of capacity building designed for government officials on how these two dimensions work together. Now, surprisingly, we talk about the Global South, and this is an initiative coming from the Global South. Not interestingly, our partners picked up, very surprising. I mean, we see that this brought the momentum on the discussions on these issues are in the COP, and yet not, for example, enough recognition of that, including particularly in the New York-based scene. Reports that are issued on this in New York do not even mention that this is happening. It's very interesting. So I think this, again, it comes at the origin of this debate. It's very focused on the Security Council, on a New York setting, and we need to globalize this debate. And when we globalize this debate, and we heard voices and perspectives from other parts of the world, we see that other parts of the world come to this with their own priorities. As I said, adaptation, access to climate finance, these conflict-affected settings, also where there's natural resources issues and environmental degradations, receive a fraction of international climate finance, and this is a big issue, and now they're trying to address it, but with very little results so far. But again, I think already an awareness around it is very good. When we did our first consultations around this issue 2 years ago, some of the MDBs and the financial institutions that are engaged in this today told us, no, we're sorry, we cannot come to this meeting on conflict and natural resources and climate. This is not our issue, it's not in our mandate, it has nothing to do with us, etc. So there's been a sea change in the mentalities, etc., but we're still far away from that. I mean, there's a capacity constraint in some countries in terms of accessing climate finance, but also on the supply side, very cumbersome procedures. You know, if you're, again, in one of these countries and you're trying to access these big funding projects, it's really, really challenging. It takes a lot of time for disbursement, etc. So these are some examples, and maybe just the last point. At the heart of this nexus, Ambika mentioned it, very important, the issue of displacement, mobility. What conflict does is trigger large-scale displacement. And we have the biggest displacement crisis globally now. And much of it linked to both conflict dynamics and climate change and environment. And it will continue to grow. World Bank estimates that end of the century, if we don't act, 100 million Africans will be displaced by climate, right? With implications for that on stability and peace in our societies. So at the heart, I see this issue of mobility and displacement really at the heart of this triple nexus and requires the involvement of the actors that are also tackling some of these issues through early warning, through prevention, through resilience of the communities on the ground, and be able to better address these issues through integrated responses. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambika, I saw you wanted to react to that, and maybe I can add a question to your reaction. We've been talking a lot about what doesn't work and that we're still in silos. I think we all agree to that. But from the work that you've been doing in India, but also in the region or globally, what would be your lessons to make it work?
That's a very hard question.
I'll ask that all of you, so the others can think already. And the audience, please already think about questions that you might want to ask later.
I just want to a little bit build on or react to what Ahmed was saying about the lack of multilateralism. I would say even before that, there's a lack of recognition of what the problem actually is. And so I go back to a bit of what Benedetta mentioned. Now, Benedetta and I have known each other for years. We're, I would say, on many ways, two sides of the same coin. And we've disagreed on many things. The one thing I don't disagree on is the proactive nature of NATO when it comes to some of these issues. Sure, the mandate is Europe, but it can set the tone for other regions as well. What I do disagree with is the use of the word non-traditional security, and we're still doing that. This was coined in the 80s and the 90s. It is 2024. If we're talking about something that's going to happen in 2030, 2040, we have to stop saying non-traditional security, and we have to recognize that that's not a thing anymore. It's not non-traditional, it's not emerging, it is here, and it is traditional. Today, as of budgets of the end of last year, more money is given for cyber security threats than environment-related security threats. Cyber is also non-traditional if you're thinking of traditional security as how that security equals defense equals military equals weapons. But why is cyber getting so much more money then? So we have to rethink that terminology that we use, and we have to recognize a lot of what then Ahmed was saying. The other thing then is also to recognize that this is not just a global south problem. In many ways, I understand the use of the terminology global south. India is a big proponent of it. For some aspects, I agree it's required. But for this, it's not a global south, global north problem at all. It is a global problem. And I'll give you the example and statistic of the wildfires. If we, and we have statistics, Ahmed talked about what's going to happen at the end of the century. None of us are going to be there to look at what's going to happen at the end of the century, right? Maybe some of the young leaders. So what's going to happen by the end of this decade? Because of the wildfires and the way they are increasing in Canada, Greece, and Australia, the displacement you are going to see from people who are going to lose land from those wildfires is going to be in the tens of millions. Now, tens of millions might not sound like a lot, especially for someone like me coming from India, but it's a lot for Canada, Europe, and Australia. So let's think about what that security means then from a cascading risk perspective. I don't think anybody here would put Canada, Greece, or Australia in that global south box. But it's the same issue. We have wildfires in India as well, and in other parts of Africa, and in Latin America. So lack of recognition of what the actual problem is and how we are addressing it. If we continue to think of it something as non-traditional, as an emerging, then we are going to see go round and round in that same cycle. To answer your question on positives, there are a lot of positives, I would say, even in India, despite all the challenges that we have, but also in other parts of the world that I have worked in. And one of the biggest positives is when you include communities in the security apparatus, you see immediate results. And I'll give one of my very favorite examples is that the NDRF, the Disaster Relief Forces in India, they are deployed, they're the first level deployment for any sort of natural related event that occurs. So whether it's an earthquake up in the Himalayas, it's a flood, it's a cyclone, tsunami, anything, right? The NDRF is there. They're highly trained. They have gone to various parts of the world to train other forces as well. They are teams that are both men and women. And very recently, in the last 3 years now, they have been training the youth as to be first responders. Because in many cases, it does take a few hours to get to where they need to get to. But the youth leaders that they have been training have been very effective, and already in the last 2 years for some of the events that we have seen in parts of coastal India that always has heavy monsoons and floodings and so things related to that, the youth have been very good about what does a first responder do. Sometimes it's as simple as just telling the community quickly that you need to move. The community has, the first responders have also been trained as to what they need to carry. So they're helping people, they're helping all. Now, by the time the NDRF comes, a lot of that information, that necessary information has already been disseminated. So the work of that NDRF is much, to a certain degree, easier. And this has already been proven successful in the last 2 years that we have seen in India, but also then in some of the other communities that we have been working in Southeast Asia. When it comes to, and this is only specifically right now being piloted on, which is a weird word to use on this kind of a situation, but piloted on flooding-related disaster and then on earthquake-related, not on others. So we do not know what kind of response there might be. And the other positive is when you have used knowledge of the women in these communities to be able to sensitize your security apparatus that is coming in after something has happened. So pre-training from women for both men and women in these forces, and these are both military forces and peacekeeping forces and non-military forces, then the reaction at the aftermath has been now again much more positive. It also helps prevent loss of life that is occurring after that particular disaster, which has been quite high in many instances because there is religious differences, there is community difference, ethnic differences. But when you have had the women come and do this training, a lot of that has reduced. So there is some good work that's happening. It's just so small and a little bit unknown. But if we have the ability to scale that upwards and wider, I think we can have so much more impact then.
I think that's a very interesting example because it really shows that it's actually much more complex than what we started with, which was this sort of two-dimensional perspective, environment and security. No, it's much more than environment security, so horizontally, but also vertically. It goes from the global level. Ahmed, you mentioned the the New York bubble all the way to the local communities and everything that happens in between that we need to link. But obviously we also have at each level certain challenges of bringing different actors in, be it youth, be it women, and so on. And so that shows the complexity, and I guess that complexity is something that a body that is called the National Cohesion and Integration Commission is particularly tasked with, right? Bringing these different dimensions together. So can you give us an example from Kenya, how this is working? How do you make these different groups, different communities, different perspectives work together for more security in the broader, non-traditional sense? And now we stop using that word, in Kenya.
Sorry, thank you very much. I want to go back to something my colleague said. When the states sit together, then the technical teams sit, then always we expect that the funding comes through. So one of the things is to look for the resources to do the work we're actually talking about. And secondly is to ensure that some of this work is mentioned in policy documents or in the development agenda so that it doesn't fall off the cracks. And while, for instance, we have platforms like national platforms where we have different actors who come together. For instance, we had the Uwiano platform. The Uwiano platform had, at the beginning, had at least 12 principal members. And one of them was the commission where I work, the National Cohesion Integration Commission, which is mandated with peace building in the country. We had the Election Commission, which is the IEBC, the independent electoral body. We had the police, which is the security sector, who were on board. We have the media, who came on board as well. So when you have different actors who listen to what is going on at the community level and who are working towards a certain agenda, which is promoting peace and cohesion at the community level, then you have a stronger platform and you have a wider space to work in. For instance,
who from the environment is on that platform?
We, in the sense that we work with communities that are facing natural resource-based conflicts, and also other partners like the United Nations Development Program. The UNDP also sits on that platform as one of the key principal members, and they also work on matters peace building. And one of the communities one of the issues within the communities in Kenya we deal with is the question of natural resource-based conflicts, especially in the northern region, where we have pastoralists. And so the question of access to resources like water, pasture, and land is an item that cuts across the peace sector. So you find that we are working in that space of environment, but from a peace perspective. So we need to have more like the Kenya forest, the Kenya wildlife. When we have the human-wildlife conflict, then the Kenya wildlife and the Kenya forest then start to engage because the resource that is being discussed comes from their end. So as much as they may not sit on the platform, they are partners who work with these 12 principal members and within this platform. But the platform also gives you a large field to play. Because if you look at like the commission, we work with all the 47 counties. We are segmented in counties in Kenya. So we are able to work with the security sector within all the 47 counties. So from the platform where we are seated, if there was a natural resource-based conflict, a conflict between two communities because of access to water or access to pasture, then it comes from the chief up to the county commissioner, and it's reported up to the commission, then we work together with that system. So that means there's a system that's all the way to the community level that's able to work on that issue. So the partnership and the network is very critical for us. But also to bring this to a different level, when, like my colleague talked about the COP28, 28. Yeah, COP28, where we had the declaration on peace, climate, and recovery and relief. When these issues are discussed at such a high level, then even the climate actors within the country then look at that and say, see, we need to start bringing this together because we have a declaration that demands that we work together as a people to continue with the mandate of peace building at the community level within the environment sector. And also, again, to bring another example is when the products of diplomatic processes also take up some of these things. For instance, peace agreements at the community level or even at the national level. Allow me to pick the example of the 2020 peace agreement of Sudan, where they talked about the environment. They had Article 14 talking about the environment, and they talked about environmental protection, ending environmental degradation, also mitigating natural resource-based conflict. So when you have peace agreements that mention that within their provisions, then that means the implementers of those peace agreements or those who are looking at it then have a provision within which to work. They have a strength that mandates them to work in a certain way. But the question again goes, are these peace agreements implemented? Are they followed up? Is there a monitoring evaluation process that tries to see how the implementation is going? Another example is when this is taken up by critical institutions within the region, and in this case I talk about the Africa region. For instance, the International Conference on the Great Lakes region has a declaration on peace and security that recognizes that peace and environment, there's a linkage. Peace, environment, and conflict, they recognize the interlinkage in this. So the question is, when this is identified at such a level, because this body is created by the states of the Great Lakes, so actors like us, civil society, or even government institutions, then how do we draw that out and make sure we give life to such provisions? And also, let me talk about the justice institutions or justice processes. For instance, when we are working in post-conflict communities, we have what we call the transitional justice processes. So in transitional justice, we have seen truth and reconciliation commissions. And right now we are lobbying for truth and reconciliation commissions to take up the environmental issue. But if you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Sierra Leone, it actually did address the issue of natural resource-based conflict and the role in that conflict. When you look at the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Liberia, it did talk about the resources, but only at a level of exploitation, which is what also the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission did. It talked about the natural resources from an exploitation element, but not from the role that this had on the conflict or the apartheid, and not on the angle of the impact of that apartheid or conflict or regime on the environment. And so when these issues are brought to such institutions, then when we talk about truth-telling, then people come to talk the truth from an environmental perspective. We saw that with the Colombia transitional justice process, where they recognized the rights of nature, and people spoke to the commission as nature talking to the commission in reference to the impact the river had, in reference to the river the forests had. So it brings a new perspective or a fresh perspective or a broader perspective in the justice system. So when these institutions or these processes are taken at different levels, then they are able to trickle down to the community, to the implementation. I must admit that the monitoring and evaluation and the follow-up of how this is done can also become a challenge because it also needs resources and it needs people who are conscious and who are willing to do the follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this makes me much more optimistic than I was maybe at the beginning of the session, because we've heard examples from India with the relief forces, from Kenya, but you also mentioned a few others where this is happening. This was now mainly local and national level examples. So I want to hand over to Benedetta for a moment to see how at NATO and in the work that you've been doing, what have you been doing and what was successful, what was maybe not so successful when it comes to integrating the environment in your strategic considerations?
Thank you. Right. So I will be remiss if I didn't start by picking on Ambika's good point about non-traditional security challenges. I think it's hard to argue with that. I would also say that I am socialized to talking to my own community, which is the defense community. And if you come to the defense community, there is a point to be made that for us as NATO, 75 years of mandate have been around conventional deterrence and conventional and nuclear deterrence and defense, and everything that is not that to us is still a newer problem set. But that said, I think even with that start, I would completely and emphatically agree with your emphasis that this is emerge. It's here. It's a defining feature of our security landscape. You're not going to have sustainable and effective security or defense policies, for that matter, if you don't integrate this consideration from climate change to environmental security and from energy security to food security into thinking about complex conflict landscapes. So yes, in short, I think we on the bottom line we agree, and we also agree on the main point that I think every panelist has made, that this is not a regional problem. This is not a global South or a global North problem. This is really a global challenge that affects us all. And that's my hook to talk about what NATO has been doing, which is mostly through the lens of climate change. But as you can imagine, there are a lot of touch points. So for NATO, there's been really 4 main objectives in how we adapt to the transversal impact of climate change on security. And it's been about awareness raising, it's been about adaptation, mitigation, and outreach. I'll go through this in a very telegraphic way, but I think it's a good template to see how a security or defense organization can take this environmental, the climate security agenda and adapt it to its mandate in a way that respects also the climate security agenda as it is. So awareness is pretty self-explanatory. We are working to integrate climate change consideration into our planning, our exercises, our indicators and warnings, which is our intelligence collection process, really into how we analyze our security environment. And that started with something that we've been doing in recent years, which is an annual assessment of how climate change is affecting each and every of our 32 allied countries, which goes to Ambika's point. The impact is not just on fragile, it's not just on existing conflict, the impact is also on each and every society in its own way because of extreme weather events, because of the new tasks that are put on the armies of our countries, which in many cases will be the first responders if there is a natural climate change induced extreme weather event that results in human or other kind of losses. So in other words, we are also looking at our own armies need to adapt to the impact of climate change. So awareness is something that has required reaching out a lot to the climate community, to the broad, beyond definitely going well beyond the defense and the security bubble. There's also a strong adaptation strand of work, and that means we need to see how do we operate in a world in which climate change is affecting everything. It's a wetter, hotter, harder security environment, and that's essentially affects everything we do, from how we procure to what systems we procure to be able to ensure that our militaries can use them effectively. But also, as I was saying before, thinking through what is the additional role of the defense sector and the armed forces in supporting civilian preparedness, in supporting resilience to climate change, extreme weather events, and other natural disasters. And that's also I think an area of work that requires and is making us talk more with the civilian sector, with civilian planners, with the civil resilience sector. So it is really about broadening the conversation, because this affects everyone, and the response has to be, as everyone has said, multi-sectoral. We cannot afford to just think within the defense bubble. So that's about adaptation.
Benedetta, I don't want to cut you short, but we're running a little bit out of time, but I will cut you short. So if you can be brief, please.
Absolutely. Got it. So that's about climate resilience of our facilities, our societies, and the way we operate. So I'll say 2 words about mitigation because we are out of time. We're also working on how we contribute to the climate crisis and how we can contribute to mitigate. And that's why NATO is pursuing a climate net zero goals by 2050. And I'm happy to elaborate, but I know we're out of time. And to do all of this, final point, we can't do it alone. And that's why the outreach is a transversal element of our strategy. So significant strategic engagement from other international organizations, United Nations, European Union, with the climate community, with civil society in board allied and partner countries. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I wish we had much more time for this, but you probably don't hear it, Benedetta, but we hear it in the room. Nature outside is also warning us that time is running out. We're hearing a big thunderstorm coming. So I want to take the opportunity to also open to the floor, because maybe we can combine the last questions that I have for the two gentlemen with questions from the floor. Please introduce yourself and be very brief and end with a question mark.
So hi, I'm Sabrina Schulz from the German Council on Foreign Relations. I have to preface my question with a remark that I first started my career in climate as a climate diplomat was the British Foreign Office 15 years ago. So I think we have come a really long way. I would not have expected sitting here 15 years later and hearing, Benedetta from NATO telling us how the whole thing has been integrated into NATO strategic thinking. However, my question is, what is exactly our theory of change? So as a community dealing with climate and environmental security, what is it that we want to kind of literally get out of the security and defense sector? Do we want security and defense professionals become better at reactive procedures? Or do we want them to become also more proactive? So also in terms of mitigation. And last point of my question is, do you see any potential for spillover as well? So we have this security-related debate. Is there an opening, an opportunity to contribute to essentially the net zero goal in 2050?
Thanks. I think definitely the first part of the question might go to you, but let's see first if we have another question from the audience. Danilo?
Well, this was an excellent discussion, and I learned a lot, as they say. I like the critique of the terminology of non-traditional threats. On the other hand, there may be still a case for using this terminology in the defense community circles and in the security-related discussion. But it has to be made rather concrete. And one concrete aspect of this could be the following. It is very likely that in the coming period we'll see growth of defense spending. And that growth of defense spending will be mostly devoted to military hardware. And military hardware is not very good in addressing the non-traditional threats to peace and security. The question therefore would be, how should the future defense spending look in order to carefully and successfully address real threats? For example, in Europe there will be a lot of talk, at least, about a possible military attack against NATO countries. Well, in my opinion, this is not likely to happen. It's much more likely that the destabilization of European countries will come as a result of displacement of people in regions other than Europe. So I think we have to be really very serious about non-traditional threats and link them to real decision-making, including decision-making on spending. So my question is, does any of the panelists have any view on this? Thank you.
Thanks. Any other last question? Yeah, there's one on this side, and then we'll have to combine all of that in some answers.
Thank you, Masha Kovic-Stein from the Faculty of Law, University of Ljubljana. I'm going to be very quick. I was very glad to hear from Munini talking about the rights of nature. And I'm going to step a little bit away here from the defense element to the natural resources and environment protection element. And I was just wondering your opinion, whether the concept of rights of nature that's now being discussed, also considering it at the international level, so, so that the states would need to respect the right of nature, elements of nature, water, forests to exist, to survive, to conserve. Could that be a piece in this whole debate, in the sense that if states would respect these rights of nature, we could actually think of less of these disputes and crises and conflicts going on?
Thank you. I'll try to organize things a little bit. I'll start with you, Benedetta, online. Very quick, one sentence. Any thought on the defense spending, anything that you can say?
Okay, I will be very, very quick. And I will say, for us, from a NATO perspective, as European allies and Canada, we are essentially making up time after decades of underinvesting in our own defense. So in that sense, we need to do that work. And that work does mean rebuilding our conventional forces and capabilities, because we essentially spent the post-Cold War decades spending too little, having our defense industrial base atrophied, and now we're making up time. So I am afraid I will have to say that for me, 2% needs to be dedicated to rebuilding our military instrument of power so that is credible. However, I will agree that in this context, we cannot just do that and think that that job done, we don't have to do anything else. And that's why we also have a lot of instruments that focus on how do we invest better? How do we invest in green and cutting edge technologies? How do we invest in technological innovation to stay ahead? And of course, all of this is for the military. And all of this does not mean that we also don't have to think about other dimensions of security, from energy, protection of critical infrastructure, countering disinformation, and investing in environmental security. So it's a long to-do list, which means it's going to be a long. There's a pretty hefty bill that needs to be footed. I wouldn't say take the resources that we're now using to rebuild our military instrument of power after decades of weakening it and divert it. I would say think holistically about security. So that would be my answer.
Thanks. And I think that especially requires a theory of change, question that I wanted to turn to you, Mark, whether water specific or not. What's our theory of change? How do we get out of that?
I think taking the blinkers off, I would respectfully disagree with Benedetta and side perhaps more with what President Turk had said. If we're absolutely committed to spending a certain amount of percentage of our GDP on something, then that's going to have an effect elsewhere. If there's anything the environment and dealing with the environment can teach us, is to think long-term, proactively, instead of always reacting. And I think, spend that much more on diplomacy, perhaps a fraction less on arms, then we would be in a better spot. It's easy to say, of course, but I think, honestly, the theory of change comes from preventing wars through diplomacy in the first place. But I would just like to point out one other thing, too. I think it's really interesting, getting back to the question of law. What has Europe contributed to this world, apart from lots of devastation outside of Europe? Laws, international law, and it's really interesting how that's progressing, ecocide especially. I think it's fascinating. But otherwise, all the good ideas that I'm hearing today are coming from Africa and Asia. And it's great that they're here, and that's what we should be listening to. That's where I'm going for thought leadership.
Thanks. I want to hand over to you, Ahmed. We're unfortunately running out of time. I hope we can continue the discussion over the coffee break, but I would love to hear from you the theory of change, or in general, where are we headed, and what do we actually want from the security actors, or what do the security actors also maybe want from the environment, or should we maybe even stop talking about we versus them?
Yeah. Okay, I think we should look from the point of view of the communities and the countries affected by this. This should be your departing point. And I will go back to what I said originally, that we have a blind spot in international cooperation around this issue. So I think what we need is some institutional innovation and creativity around how to address this. If I take by comparison the AIDS crisis in the 90s when it happened, there was a huge mobilization around it. UNAIDS was created. There was institutional innovation to address something that clearly had multidimensional effects, not only health, but socioeconomics, impact, labor, etc. And the system could not on its own just look at it from a health perspective. So this is what I think is really badly needed. We tried to contribute to this through the initiative we did at COP27. There was then the declaration. Declaration also is a welcome development that builds on what we did, but it lacks a mechanism. There's no mechanism for follow-up. It's left to everyone, again, to see what they're doing. It's all very, again, good examples, but local, national level, very diverse, very fragmented. We really, and just to add that we are just at the beginning of the changes we will see because of this, the climate impacts in the middle. I mean, we're just at the beginning. This is so far-reaching. The scale of it requires a much more higher level of ambitions and more creativity and institutional innovation to create the platforms or adjust the current platforms that can bring these integrated responses. And I ended by a quote, you know, because I heard you said you were optimist by the positives. So they say optimist invented the plane, pessimist invented the parachute. So that gives you realism at the end. We need realism, but also a lot of energy and creativity to tackle these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I got the sign that we have to stop. I think we could continue the discussion much longer. I think we've opened a lot of interesting questions, hopefully to be continued next year. I would like to invite all of you to approach the speakers over coffee, continue the discussion in smaller groups. I know there's still some outstanding questions on the rights of nature and others. Happy to discuss that, and that's a topic that I work on, so welcome to discuss that. But with that, I want to close the session. I want to thank all our panelists, and I want to specifically also thank Ambassador Tanja Mišková, who's the mastermind behind this session. So thanks for bringing all of us here. Thanks.